The padlock was older than my mother. I stood on the porch of a cabin in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado on a Tuesday in late October, holding a key that had been mailed to me in a certified letter I almost didn't open because certified letters had not historically brought good news, and I looked at that padlock, a heavy iron thing, green-black with 75 years of oxidation, and understood that it had not been opened since 1948. 75 years. Whatever was inside that cabin had not been touched, not been breathed on, not been seen by a single living person since Harry Truman was president, and my grandfather was a young man who, for reasons nobody had ever explained to me, had walked away from this property and never returned. I had been sleeping in my car for 11 weeks. My sons, Marcus, who was 9, and little Theo, who had just turned 6, were with my sister in Pueblo because I could not simultaneously look for work and look after them from the front seat of a 2008 Honda Accord. Every morning I drove to the public library in Alamosa to use the Wi-Fi and apply for jobs and try to hold myself together with the specific brittle determination of someone who has run out of options. Except the one directly in front of them. The one directly in front of me, that Tuesday, was this cabin. My grandfather's cabin. Sealed in 1948. Left to me by a man I had met exactly twice and barely remembered. In a will that had apparently been updated 6 months before his death in 2021 and that I had not learned about until a probate attorney in Denver tracked me down through 3 forwarding addresses. I put the key in the padlock. It turned. And what was on the other side of that door rearranged everything, not just my circumstances, but everything I understood about who I came from. My name is Delia Crane Mostert. I am 34 years old. And I have a graduate degree in landscape architecture that I completed at 27, and that has been both the making of my professional identity and the source of a particular irony that I will explain momentarily. I grew up in Pueblo, Colorado, in a working-class household that produced, over 2 generations, the specific kind of striving that doesn't have a name but is recognizable in families like mine, the determination to be more educated than your parents while inheriting their financial precarity, with the addition of student debt. My mother cleaned office buildings for 30 years. My father drove long haul until his back gave out, and then he fixed appliances until his hands did. They worked without complaint and they sacrificed without theater, and they sent me to college with the specific pride of people investing everything in a future they believed was possible even when the evidence was mixed. I had believed it too. For a while, the belief was justified. I designed public green spaces and urban ecological corridors for a firm in Denver for 6 years. Good work, meaningful work, the kind that improved the lived experience of neighborhoods in ways that were visible and lasting. I was not highly paid, but I was solvent. I had an apartment. I had a used car that ran. I had my boys, whose father had left before Theo was born and whose absence I had metabolized into a kind of functional self-sufficiency that felt, most of the time, like strength. The irony, the firm I worked for specialized in designing spaces for communities. In 2022, they lost their 2 largest municipal contracts simultaneously when city budgets contracted. The layoffs were swift and without sentiment. I was among the first 12 to go, which I was told had nothing to do with my performance, and I believed this. Because I am someone who pays attention to institutional patterns and could see clearly that the cuts were seniority-based, and I had 6 years against colleagues who had 12. Believing it didn't help me pay rent. 7 months of job searching produced 2 interviews and no offers in a design market that had contracted everywhere, not just at my former firm. My savings lasted 5 months. I sold what I could sell. I negotiated payment plans and then defaulted on them, and then had the specific humiliation of having conversations with landlords and utilities companies that always ended the same way because there is only one ending available when the money is gone. My sister Renata took the boys in May, which was the right decision for them and the hardest thing I have done. I told Marcus and Theo I was going to find us a new home and that living with Aunt Renata was an adventure. And Marcus looked at me with the 12-year-old's version of a 7-year-old's total faith, which is more complicated but no less trusting. And I got in my car and drove away and cried for 45 minutes before I stopped. I was sleeping in the Accord in Alamosa when the letter came. My sister forwarded it, certified, with a note that said, "Delia, this looks important, please open it." The probate attorney's letter was 3 pages. It contained, among other things, coordinates for a property in the San Juan Mountains and the sentence. The property has been sealed and undisturbed since August 1948 per the explicit instruction of the decedent, your maternal grandfather, Aurelio James Crane. My grandfather, who I had met twice, had left me a sealed cabin in the mountains. I drove there the following Tuesday. My knowledge of my grandfather could be summarized in approximately 2 minutes of conversation and 1 photograph. He had been my mother's father, not the grandfather who came to Christmas, not the grandfather who called on birthdays. He and my grandmother had divorced in the mid-1950s, before my mother was school age. And the divorce had produced the kind of distance that becomes permanent when nobody moves to close it and the years keep accumulating in the gap. My mother spoke of him rarely and without bitterness, which I had always read as indifference. She said he had been a difficult man with the economy of someone who has made peace with not going further. She said he had worked in mining, geological survey work, originally, before the war, and then something different after. She said he had loved the mountains the way some men love things they can't bring home, which I hadn't understood when she said it and understood more now. I met him once when I was 8. At a gathering I didn't know was a gathering until we arrived, a family reunion on my grandmother's side that Aurelio had apparently been invited to at someone's insistence and had appeared at. Briefly. A tall man with white hair and very blue eyes who shook my hand formally and said, "You look like the Crane side," and disappeared before dinner. I met him again at 31, at my grandmother's funeral. He was 86 then, moving carefully, and he had found me in the reception line and said, "You're Delia." A statement, not a question. He held my hand for a moment and looked at me with an expression I couldn't interpret and said, "There are things that need to be set right." Then my aunt intervened with some other obligation and he and I didn't speak again before he left. He died in 2021 at 95. I did not hear about the death until 6 months later, from the probate attorney. The attorney's letter included a photocopy of a handwritten instruction Aurelio had left with his estate documents. The cabin on Crane Ridge has been sealed since August 1948 and is to remain sealed until it passes to a blood descendant of the Crane line who has sufficient need and sufficient character to use what is inside it properly. That person is my granddaughter Delia. If circumstances have been unkind to her, which I expect they will have been at some point, as circumstances often are, she will know what to do. If circumstances have been unkind to her. He had written that in advance of my life and still somehow known. The property was 17 miles from the nearest paved road. Which is not a description that fully communicates the experience of driving 17 miles of single-lane mountain road in late October in a 2008 Honda Accord. The road went up from the highway through aspen stands that had gone fully gold and were beginning to drop, the leaves falling slowly in the cold clear air of an October afternoon at 9,000 feet. The light through the aspens doing the specific luminous thing that aspen light does in autumn. Which was beautiful in a way that my circumstances made difficult to receive without a complicated mixture of feelings. I was driving to my grandfather's sealed cabin in a car I was sleeping in. With 11 weeks of accumulated tension in my shoulders and a key in my jacket pocket that had been mailed to me from a dead man's estate. The aspens were doing their best. The road climbed for 7 of the 17 miles, then leveled onto a ridge, the spine of terrain that I recognized, from the coordinates and the topographic map I had printed at the library. As Crane Ridge. A family name. My family name. On a ridge in the San Juan Mountains that I had not known existed until 3 weeks ago. The cabin appeared at the end of a track that diverged from the main road, barely a track, more the memory of a track, the vegetation having reclaimed most of it in 75 years of non-use. I drove carefully. The Accord was not built for this. We made it. I parked. Got out. Stood. The cabin was small, a single-story log structure, the logs hand-hewn, the chinking between them largely intact. The roof was metal, which had weathered but held. The porch boards, I tested them carefully before stepping fully, were solid beneath my feet. The old growth would having compressed with age into something denser and more durable than new lumber. The mountain was still around me. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a place that is full of life that has learned to move quietly. Pine and spruce on three sides, the ridge dropping away on the fourth to a view of the valley below that was, in the slanted October light, genuinely breathtaking. My grandfather had looked at this view repeatedly, for some period of his life. Then he had padlocked the door and not come back. I stood on the porch for a while before I used the key. I don't know exactly what I was doing, preparing myself, perhaps, or giving some respect to the 75 years of sealed time that was about to end. Or maybe I was just afraid of what was on the other side, because hope, after 11 weeks in a car, is a complicated emotion and I didn't want to have it too completely before I knew whether it was warranted. I put the key in the padlock. It turned with a resistance that was not mechanical failure but simple age, the tumblers moving through decades of oxidation to their correct positions, the shackle releasing. I pulled the padlock free. I opened the door. The air that came out was extraordinary. Not stale, exactly. Sealed environments at altitude don't produce the same staleness as sealed spaces at lower elevations, the cold and the dry having preserved rather than putrefied. It was old air. The air of a specific moment, the summer of 1948, preserved in a log cabin on a Colorado ridge for 75 years. It smelled of pine resin and cold stone and something I couldn't immediately identify, a mineral quality, clean and specific, like the smell of rock after rain. I stood in the doorway until my eyes adjusted. The cabin was a single main room with a partition at the back separating a sleeping area. The main room held a wood stove, cast iron, intact, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf unit against one wall, and a workbench along the back wall beneath the windows. The windows were intact, the glass slightly distorted in the way of old glass, the light through them giving the interior a quality that was not quite present day. Everything was covered in the dust of 7 decades. But everything was there. Nothing had been disturbed. The chairs were pushed up to the table as if someone had just risen from them. A coffee mug sat on the table with a ring of residue at its base, the last coffee my grandfather had drunk in this cabin, dried to a dark stain that had survived 3/4 of a century. I moved carefully, not wanting to disturb the arrangement before I understood it. The shelves held books and tools and several glass jars with metal lids that contained, when I examined them, geological samples, rocks and minerals labeled in small handwriting on strips of tape. My grandfather's handwriting. Labels that named the samples with the precision of a trained geologist: pyrite, sample 7, shaft 3 and quartz vein, upper level, and others I couldn't parse without more context. On the workbench, maps. Rolled and stacked in a wooden holder that my grandfather had apparently built for the purpose. I unrolled the first carefully, holding the corners with the jars from the shelf. A geological survey map. Hand annotated in the same small handwriting as the rock labels. The annotations marked locations, measurements, and notations I recognized from my landscape architecture training as the language of geological assessment, but specifically the language of mineral assessment. The kind that gets applied when someone is trying to determine whether a site contains economically significant deposits. The map covered Crane Ridge and the surrounding terrain. I unrolled 2 more. Same coverage, different notations. All in my grandfather's hand. All from the late 1940s, the dates in the margins indicated 1946, 1947, early 1948. On the workbench, weighted flat by one of the rock jars, a leather-bound notebook. The cover marked only with the initials AJC Aurelio James Crane. I opened it. The first entry was dated June 3, 1946. The last was dated August 14, 1948, 6 days before the date stamped on a newspaper I found folded on the shelf, which was as close as I could determine to when the cabin had been sealed. I sat down at my grandfather's table, in my grandfather's chair, and began to read. The notebook was a field journal. Not a diary. Aurelio had not been a man, judging by the writing, who was interested in describing his interior life. It was a record of work, geological surveys, sample analyses, measurement logs. Technical language interspersed with occasional observations about conditions and methodology. The handwriting was precise, consistent, the notation system logical and self-evident even to someone not trained in geological survey work. And running through it, beginning in the spring of 1947 and intensifying through 1948, was the documentation of a discovery. My grandfather had found silver. Not a vein. Not a marginal deposit of the kind that requires expensive extraction to produce marginal returns. A significant deposit, the notebook's analyses, cross-referenced with the annotated maps, indicated a body of mineralization along the eastern face of Crane Ridge that he estimated at. I stopped on this page and read the number 3 times, sufficient to produce viable extraction yields across a period of decades. He had found it on land he owned. His family had held the Crane Ridge parcel since the 1920s. The notebook referenced an earlier generation's acquisition without elaborating on the circumstances. The entries from 1947 and early 1948 documented his surveying methodology, his growing certainty about the deposit's extent. His communications with a geological colleague in Denver who confirmed his readings. And then, beginning in the spring of 1948, a different kind of entry. The name that appeared was Harrington, never a first name, always just Harrington. From the context, a mining company representative. The entries documented meetings, negotiations, proposals. Harrington was interested in the Crane Ridge deposit. Harrington was offering to buy the mineral rights. The numbers Harrington offered were, by 1948 standards, significant. And my grandfather had refused. The notebook explained why. Not in emotional language, Aurelio was not an emotional writer. In practical language, the language of a man laying out a decision's logic, Harrington's operation will employ company workers. Nothing from this mountain will reach this family or this valley. The extraction will be efficient and complete and the land will be returned to us depleted and scarred. My children will have the deed to a worked-out ridge. My alternative, hold the deed. Hold the surveys. Let the deposit sit until the family has need of it and the means to approach it on terms that serve us rather than them. This may be 50 years. It may be more. The silver is not going anywhere. He had refused Harrington. He had sealed the cabin with everything that documented the deposit, the surveys, the analyses, the maps. The notebook, because Harrington had become aggressive in ways the final entries described obliquely but clearly, legal pressure, claim disputes. One entry that read only Harrington's people at the property line again with a date. He had sealed it and left and never returned because returning would have renewed the conflict. He had chosen to wait. He had chosen to let time make the decision easier. He had written, in the notebook's final entry, on August 14, 1948, I am leaving this for whoever in the Crane line has the most need and the most sense. I trust that person will be the right person for the moment. I will not specify further because I cannot know the future. I can only preserve the option. My grandfather had not abandoned the cabin. He had protected it. He had protected what was inside it. For his family. For the Crane line. For whoever the right person was when the right moment came. He had died at 95 having never told my mother, never told anyone, having held this for 7 decades without a word. Because he was protecting it. Because he had decided the protection required silence. Because sometimes the deepest love operates in the longest possible silence, building what it cannot yet give. I sat at his table for a very long time. The October light moved through the old glass and across the table and I sat in it and felt the specific grief of understanding someone too late and the simultaneous comfort of understanding them at all. I drove down to Alamosa that night and called my sister from the library parking lot and told her everything. Renata listened without interrupting, which is the gift of a sibling who knows when to wait. When I finished, she said, "How are you?" "Not about the cabin." "About me?" "I don't know yet," I said. "But I think I will be." The process that followed was long, and I will describe it honestly rather than compressing it into something more dramatic than it was. I retained a mining and mineral rights attorney through a legal aid referral, a woman named Carolyn Betts who practiced in Durango and who had the specific professional quality of someone who has heard unusual situations before and evaluates them on their merits. She reviewed the notebook and the maps and the surveys and spent 3 weeks with a consulting geological engineer who made 2 visits to the ridge. The engineer's assessment confirmed the deposit. Not exactly as my grandfather had documented it, 75 years of geological understanding had refined the analytical methods, but consistent with his core findings. The deposit was real. It was significant. Modern extraction methods and current silver markets made it economically viable in ways that 1948 technology and 1948 prices had not. The mineral rights, attached to the property deed, were mine. I spent for months researching what responsible mineral development looked like in the 21st century. Because I was a landscape architect and I understood what extraction does to land, and I was not going to hand my grandfather's ridge to an operation that would do to it what Harrington had proposed to do in 1948. I read everything I could find. I talked to environmental consultants. I talked to land restoration specialists. I entered negotiation with a company that specialized in what the industry called low-impact extraction, a term I scrutinized carefully before I accepted it. Because terminology without enforcement is just marketing. The contract I signed, after 4 months of negotiation and 2 rejected versions, contained restoration requirements, environmental monitoring commitments, and a community benefit provision that directed a percentage of extraction proceeds to a watershed protection fund for the San Juan Mountains. My grandfather would not have imagined any of this. The technology wasn't there in 1948. The regulatory framework wasn't there. The environmental consciousness certainly wasn't there. But the impulse behind what he had done, the insistence that the mountain's benefit should reach the Crane family and the surrounding community rather than disappearing into a corporation's ledger. That impulse I had understood and honored. The initial payment from the mineral rights agreement was structured as an advance against extraction proceeds, $380,000. I sat in Carolyn's office in Durango when she told me the number, and I thought about 11 weeks in a car and 50 cents and 2 quarters and the way the world can turn on a padlock key mailed from a dead man's estate. I did not cry in Carolyn's office. I thanked her and walked to my car and sat there for 20 minutes, and then I drove to Pueblo. I brought my boys home. Marcus and Theo. My sons. I brought them home to a rental house in Alamosa that I signed a lease on with 4 months deposit and a full year's rent paid in advance because I never wanted to think about lease negotiations again for a very long time. I enrolled them in school. I bought them beds. I cooked dinner on a stove in a kitchen that was ours for the first time in almost a year. And Theo climbed into my lap while I was still standing at the stove because he had not quite grown out of that yet, and I was grateful for it. I went back to Crane Ridge in the spring, when the snow had cleared from the high road and the aspens were beginning to leaf. I went alone. I opened the cabin. The new padlock I had installed over the winter opened easily. Its mechanisms clean and modern, and I sat at my grandfather's table and drank coffee from my own thermos and looked at the maps he had made and the jars of labeled samples and the notebook that contained 75 years of patient, protective love. I am rebuilding my practice. Landscape architecture, but differently now. I have incorporated ecological restoration consulting, working with land that has been affected by extractive use. Applying my professional training to the question my grandfather's decision had posed across 75 years. What does it mean to take something from the earth and leave it better than you found it? He couldn't answer that question in 1948. The tools weren't there. I am trying to answer it now, with the tools available to me, in the mountains he loved and protected and left to the right person when the right moment came. The coffee mug is still on the table. I haven't moved it. I don't think I will. It sat there for 75 years as the emblem of a morning my grandfather decided to leave, decided to protect this place by leaving it intact rather than staying and fighting for it, and it will sit there now as evidence of the patience that decision required. 75 years. My grandfather was a young man when he walked away from this cabin. He lived another 47 years after sealing it, without telling anyone, carrying the knowledge of what was here like a long-term investment in a future he would not personally inhabit. He died at 95, having made peace with not knowing who would open the door. He said, in that handwritten instruction, if circumstances have been unkind to her, which I expect they will have been at some point. He expected this. Not with resignation, with preparation. He understood that the Crane line would face hard times because every family does, and he had built something that would be waiting when the hard times came. I was sleeping in a car. He had the answer in a padlocked cabin on a ridge. He couldn't reach me directly. Time and estrangement and his own difficult nature had closed those paths. So he built the longest possible bridge, a deed, a will, a probate attorney, a certified letter forwarded through 3 addresses, and trusted that it would hold. It held. I think about what it means to love someone across a distance you cannot close. To prepare for a person you may never fully know. To trust the future with the thing that matters most. It means you keep the padlock on. You keep the surveys dry. You leave a key with the attorney and a note that says, the right person will know what to do. He was right. I knew.